they on?
No, not, you don't have to. Hi, good morning everybody, and welcome to, I was going to say the first panel of the day. It's actually only my first panel of the day. You're probably onto your third or fourth by now, and we're going to be talking about yet another. Every room so far there's been an elephant in it, and we've had to talk about it, and this morning's elephant is the potential of AI to create more dependencies in news organisations on platforms. There you go. I've edited the title of our panel even without ChatGPT. I'm going to get the panel, Charlie, Nick, Uli, Felix, just to briefly introduce themselves and also tell you what their work currently is that involves AI. So I'm going to start to my right, my colleague, Charlie Beckett.
Great, thanks very much, Emily, and great to see so many people here. My name's Charlie Beckett. I used to be a journalist at places like the BBC and Channel 4 News. For the last 15 years, I've been a professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the LSE. I run a think tank there called Polis. It's an international journalism think tank. And for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been running the Journalism AI project, which is a global initiative. Like this festival, it's sponsored by the Google News Initiative, and we have worked over that time with hundreds, if not thousands, of journalists literally around the world, helping them to understand AI and helping them to see what it can do to support their journalism in a responsible way. And we do loads of kind of training and information and experimentation and online workshops, and we have a lovely festival as well, but ours is online. It's not in spectacular buildings like this.
Well, we're definitely not coming to that then, if it's not in somewhere like this.
There's no Aperol Spritz.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Nick.
Hi everyone, good morning. I'm Nick Diakopoulos. I am an associate professor in communication studies and computer science at Northwestern University. I run a lab there, the Computational Journalism Lab, do a lot of research on the impact of AI automation algorithms in the media ecosystem, in the news ecosystem, in news production. This year I'm actually on sabbatical, spending some time in Europe, up in Amsterdam, visiting the University of Amsterdam, working with folks there in the AI Media Democracy Lab, and just recently started an initiative called Generative AI Newsroom, where I'm sort of working with folks in the community to explore and experiment with how generative AI can actually be useful for news production. And where do we draw the lines between capabilities, limitations, what are the ethical implications, what are the intersections with legal issues like copyright and plagiarism. Check it out, and if you are also experimenting with generative AI, shoot me a note. I'd love the resource there to become more of a community resource where we're sort of working together to figure out the technology.
Thanks. Uli.
Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Uli Koppen. I'm part of German public broadcasting, Bayerischer Rundfunk, which is the southern section of German public broadcasting. I co-run 3 teams around investigative data journalism and AI. It's BR Data, our data team, and the AI and Automation Lab. And what we're doing is we're using automation and AI for investigative data journalism and also for the product side. So we're somehow looking on the dark side of tech with investigations. And we're also trying to find out how we can use this technology for the good for journalism. So I'm very looking forward to the discussion.
Felix.
Hello, I'm Felix Simon. I'm a communications scholar at the Oxford Internet Institute, where my work in the last, I think, 4 years has been looking at how news organizations in the US, UK, and Germany use AI, both in production, distribution, and what that ultimately means for them as news organizations, for journalism, and by extension, for the public sphere. And a part of my work within this has been to look at the role of tech companies and platform companies in particular, because they're sort of leading figures in developing and distributing AI to the news and therefore play quite an important role. And that's why I'm so pleased to be co-organizing this panel with Emily and to discuss this with all my lovely, like my kind of AI peer group in many ways. I mean, I've known all of you for quite a long time, so it's such a pleasure to be with you in this beautiful old church.
Yes, we were just discussing whether or not this was going to be an adversarial panel, and we're a bit worried that we're all going to end up agreeing with each other. And just very briefly, I'm Emily Bell from the Town Centre for Digital Journalism, Columbia Journalism School, New York City. We do research, etc., but we also teach, and we already have ChatGPT and various NLP models being used in our classrooms. Our data program has been using it really sort of for the last you talked to our data students at the beginning of the course in September, and they were all using R and Python, and you talk to them now and they say, I don't know how we ever did this without ChatGPT. Then in my classroom I teach information warfare reporting. My students have all been doing fail tests and saying, this is terrible, we need it to be strictly regulated, and I can't believe that this is running free, so there's a sort of an interesting tension there already. Felix, I'm just going to go back to you to start on this, because you actually said, I take this specific interest in platforms and how they intersect with the news and what AI is at the moment. So I'm just going to ask everybody ask you to start, Felix, on give us a sort of a quick overview at the moment of what is the role of AI in general, do you think, and what is it in the news? I apologise to people who feel they've been to 15 different AI sessions already, but also there's a new Reader's Start Here element to this. So if you just want to give us a brief overview.
So basically, the quick take on what does AI do to news organizations?
Or what's the role of it? How are we envisaging the role of it at the moment? Because I think there's an interesting thing that Nick just said about working with communities, etc. So I think that everybody has a slightly different conception of how it's being used right now, or how it should be used right now.
Yeah, I mean, I always like sort of setting the ground stage first. I think in many ways it's a technological development that we've seen coming over the last maybe 10 years, depending on where you want to draw the line. And it's not one thing. I think that's the most important thing to remember about AI. It's not one thing. It's sort of a set of technologies, a set of structures, and ultimately that's being used by news organizations as a sort of set of tools in various contexts. That could be in the production of news, so recent examples are quite illustrative, generative AI helping in writing content, for instance, but it also comes into play at the distribution side. So take something like a paywall. New York Times is a good example. The entire paywall is dynamic, so it basically detects you as a reader coming to them and then tries to get you to the point where you will actually subscribe and pay for them. And that's done through a machine learning approach where they take the data they have about you and then sort of fine-tune their model and the number of articles you will get for free. And then at some point, the system will say, well, actually, now you have to pay. So that's basically, it sort of comes in at various stages of this entire, what we call in research, the gatekeeping process. So the entire stage from a piece of information traveling through news organizations to the point where it becomes news on your phone or your device.
Charlie, you look at, as you say, globally, at how news organizations are currently implementing it. Felix talks about efficiencies and being able to assess things better in every stage of the. Are there any other? Is there something missing from that? Are there any other organisations, or what are the specifics you've seen of how organisations implement at the moment, and what's the sort of major use case for it? Would you say?
Well, as Felix says, it's incredibly diverse. I mean, Uli talked about, in a way, one of the most exciting bits of it, which is investigative journalism, and I think there's sort of broadly the kind, thinking of it from a newsroom-centered perspective, it does various things like it'll do the kind of boring, repetitive labor that you probably don't want to do as a journalist, kind of routine data like weather and sports results, or perhaps, routine reformatting of some of your content. And you probably, your time is better spent doing something else. But then, yes, it does that more exciting things that actually humans couldn't do. Humans could not go through hundreds of thousands of digital documents that have been leaked to you to assess, where the story is, where the scandal is. or a big data set, for example, of health records or court records, or perhaps satellite imagery of deforestation in the Amazon. That's the more sort of creative one. And I think obviously with generative AI, on the one hand, people are kind of thinking, oh my God, how do we control this? On the other hand, I know that journalists are using it already, for example, in video editing. It can really speed up the time it takes to do quite complicated editing, but generally always with the human in the loop. They're using it literally as a tool rather than as a system. But the potential there for more imaginative uses, ways of expanding your coverage, expanding your reach, expanding the diversity of your content, and optimizing the way that you connect to the audience. I think that's one bit. I mean, Felix mentioned the paywall idea, but one of the biggest challenges facing journalism at the moment, and there are so many, but I think one of them is simply that our users, if you like, or the public, feel overwhelmed by the amount of news and information and sources there are, and the more we can do to help people connect to the information that's relevant, useful and interesting for them personally, I think is super, super important. So yeah, it's just incredibly diverse. I will also say very quickly, it's just incredibly diverse. We work with, you know, tiny newsrooms doing very specialist niche stuff in the global south. We also work with huge newsrooms like Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, etc., who are doing things at massive scale. Exactly.
Yeah.
As Felix says, this is not entirely new.
Well, hold that thought on production of content, because I think we're definitely going to come back to that. Uli, do you want to just talk about, again, sort of that very specific sort of what I thought you said something very interesting about there is the dark side of AI as well. So one thing we don't talk about is how we talk about how we're using these tools. Also, you know, kind of how should it affect journalists in the newsroom in terms of how they view it almost as a story, as a societal story as well?
It absolutely is. It has those two sides, as you said, and I call it the dark side, or let's say the side where we should discuss as a society. How do we want to use algorithms? How do we want to, embed them into our systems? How do we want to talk about them? Because I think there's not much talk about, is there a good use for them and how? Because the how is so important. It's not the tool is bad or the tool is good. It's a tool. We can use it. And we have to decide how we are using it. For example, all those scoring algorithms out there, they are already there. We are scored on an economic basis, for example. So we have to discuss, is that good for our economic systems? And I think there are some arguments pro. And how do we do it that it serves us as a society? So this is what we're doing as investigative journalists. We're looking at those systems that work algorithmically. AI is just one part of it. And there's, a certain hype around AI, of course. I always use this hype as an excuse to discuss it as a broader set of tools. So I would look at automation in society from an investigative point of view and also from a product point of view. It's very useful to assess what you can use those tools for as a broader set of tools, as you said before, Felix.
I think that's such a brilliant point, and one which I think is often missing, and I think we'll come back to it in this panel, that question about not just the assumption that implementation is automatic without actually examining what does it do, both kind of institutionally and culturally.
But I think that's kind of what's happening. You know, that's what's happening right now. To listen to Charlie and other folks on the panel. I mean, a lot of the technology is almost becoming invisible in the newsroom. I mean, you know, we're using AI to transcribe interviews all the time. It's used to optimize the paywall. It's used to optimize subscriptions. You know, technology follows a trajectory where it becomes more normalized, and maybe we forget that we're using this very powerful technology. But it's important to come back to that critical element and always be thinking about, well, how is this shaping our news production process? How is this changing or potentially influencing our our goals, our values, what do we stand for, and to try to be deliberate about making it visible again where it's actually being used.
So I'm going to go to the, so Charlie very kindly offered to play the role of, I think you said Google lackey. So the heart of the question about this panel is really, okay, so this all sounds great, but these are tools and methods and ways of working and assumptions about how many people you'll have in a newsroom, which are to some extent increasing dependencies on large-scale technology companies. And I think it's sort of interesting that the major project in this field has been funded for 5 years by Google, and credit that they have somebody brilliant like Charlie leading it. But isn't this just another talk about that dependency, defend that dependency, if you like?
It's not just a dependency. I think there's a kind of risk generally around these technologies. So I would categorize the risks in 3 ways, and people like Nick and Felix can give you better detail on this and where it's going. But there's the big risk around, AI in general. It doesn't matter whether you work in medicine or media, which is this is a set of technologies that have biases, that are generated by big companies that are not necessarily accountable. So I think that's a universal concern for everyone. Then I think there's the very specific concern for journalists. Is this tool I'm using accurate enough? Is it dependent on data that is not representative, for example? And then I think there is the industry risk, if you like, which is partly around a dependency, but actually it's also around what kind of dependency do you mean? Do you mean financial, or do you mean that you're buying into a set of technologies, for example, that you don't really understand? You know, and you don't know where they're going to develop. So right now, with this extraordinary momentum around generative AI, we are kind of hanging on to the coattails of a bunch of people who are experimenting live, and they're kind of using us as part of the experiment. And we're very much aware that part of this is driven by competition between giants like Google and Microsoft. It's not necessarily driven by, how can you put it, the correct research imperatives, if you like. All I would say, though, and this is the tech bro bit, is, okay, I think that's all manageable. And when I talk to news organizations, especially around the world in the global south and so on, this is not that the idea of dependency on technology is not their problem. Their problem is plummeting revenue, trying to get audiences, dealing with political interference, all those kind of issues. And they actually have the opposite problem, which is, please, can you just help us to understand and access some of this technology so we do not fall behind? Because they are aware that if we don't strengthen the news organizations around the world, partly using the technology, then other people are going to start providing information and control the information sphere. But then we come back to tech companies.
But we've just seen, though, that tech companies have pretty much zero commitment to news.
And I think that's a good thing in the sense that the original question of the title was, will the tech companies have control over the news? No, they won't, because they're not really bothered about the news, except, of course, when it affects them. They don't want to control the news in the way that Rupert Murdoch wants to control the news, or that, Rishi Sunak wants to control the news. The tech companies they want to have an influence over the news industry, but even that, we are a tiny industry. They're much more interested in medicine becoming dependent upon those companies. They're much more interested in education becoming dependent on these companies. We are peanuts to them.
I don't quite buy the we don't really matter, so it's actually better that we don't really matter. I could see Felix sort of bristling and
well, you asked for the tech bro approach.
Exactly. So this is good. We're only 18 minutes in. We're already adversarial.
I mean, I'm not so much bristling. I think that's just basically it's a question: how do you define control in the first place? And I do actually agree with Charlie if we want to make the argument that, for instance, Google or Facebook, now called Meta, want to control what is being written, say, about them or someone else through AI, which they sort of bring into newsrooms, or which is developed by them and then brought into newsrooms. I think that's clearly an argument that's very hard to make. I don't actually subscribe to that personally. But if we think controller as controlling the conditions under which news work, broadly construed, takes place, both in the production and distribution, then it's a different story. And that could be as simple as saying, well, if you have an AI tool in a newsroom which helps you as a journalist to, say, transcribe something or analyze something, and you don't actually have an insight into how this tool works because you have not developed it yourself, you're completely reliant on a company who has its own sort of set of interests, then that's a form of control of the condition of how you do your work ultimately. And that might not necessarily be used for nefarious purposes, but I think we sort of have to broaden the understanding of what control means in this context.
And it's not just control, right? I mean, if we do broaden out, we can talk about something like power, which kind of gets at the idea of an ability to influence another person's or entity's behavior. And it's not just about newsrooms using AI and tech having power through that route. It's also about tech putting generative AI out in the world so that anyone on the planet can use it and produce misleading information, which is another way to influence the media ecosystem, and which has huge ramifications for journalism in terms of having to then fact check that information or debunk it or spend time interviewing people, and asking questions about misleading information that was produced by a model, or having to look up a reference to a URL that doesn't exist. It's kind of an attention tax for journalists to have to spend their time dealing with this. And that's another aspect of how tech power works its way through the broader ecosystem and has implications for journalists.
And I'd love to add another layer of dependency, the economic dependency. We have to make very, very conscious decisions about what kind of algorithms we are using and how. Very practical example, we are right now training an algorithm that helps us filter our user comments. This is something all the newsrooms do in the whole world, and you can use a lot of vendors for that. But you have to make with algorithms that are trained with data, you have to make a very conscious decision that your data is training a foreign algorithm, and this algorithm is becoming better and better with your data, and you will be happier and happier to use this model. But if you want to change vendors, it's called a vendor lock-in, it won't be easy. We don't only have this whole implementation stuff we have to take care about, we had to do before, but with AI and training data, we also have to be aware of that we are really having a treasure. It's our own data. And we have to make a conscious decision about, are we training our own models or not? And there are pros and cons. I'm not absolutely pro, we are only training our own models and we have to be independent kind of discussion, because, I mean, there is so much tech out there we can just use. But it can be open source, for example. It can be used by others, for example, and this environment will grow and grow, and perhaps we as media companies should support this environment. So first part of our decision. And second part, a purely economic one. What if we want to change vendor? And this decision has to be very conscious, as I said, and you have to have those thoughts before.
Felix,
yeah, just briefly riffing off this before I will hand over to Charlie, who I think wants to respond to that. It kind of looked like it, but I think one of the things Uli just described is really interesting. In many cases, news organizations are not quite aware of where they are sort of dependent on the infrastructure provided by what is pretty much an oligopoly of big tech companies. And I'm not going to say that they are sort of all evil. I think all those sort of big platform business, they have multiple interests. They're sort of quite multipolar in their governance. But increasingly, because they are the leaders in developing and distributing and deploying AI, their tech comes in at all these like tiny little points within organizations. And it's quite hard actually for you as an organization yourself to get an overview of where this is happening. But structurally, if you take that all together, that potentially has sort of an accumulative effect. And I think that's one quite important thing. Basically becoming aware of this being a thing in the first place.
And I guess this is a very great moment to lobby for infrastructure. You know, this thing journalists don't think is very sexy. So if you're talking to your CEOs and if you want to lobby for APIs, for metadata, for systems that are kind of legacy, no one wants to touch that because it's so difficult to do. It's legacy systems, but we have to do those long-term decisions. We have to think about it now, and we have to make conscious decisions about that. And the hype around AI is, as I said, a very good moment to lobby for that now.
I think that's a great point, and to me it feels as though I unfortunately am old enough to have lived through an entire cycle as it related to, for instance, the implementation of social media and platform and other platform technologies in the newsroom. And one can see exactly the same arguments being repeated, like these open source tools are going to democratize this use, they're going to democratize the field. And you think, well, we heard that in 2005, exactly the opposite happened. Let us put your newsroom in the hands of our platform technologies, and everything will be we can help you make more money. I mean, BuzzFeed was the absolute sort of leading edge of that and shut its news operation yesterday, saying you can't, Ben Smith, who was at the time, said you cannot make money actually on this model. And with AIs, I think it's slightly different because it's a tool in the middle of the newsroom, but that understanding of what it will do to your organization. I mean, Nick, you're a computer scientist and you've worked for, decade plus with newsrooms. To at least point about what are the things that news organizations should be lobbying for in terms of tech companies. I mean, again, I'm not sure that our tech bro here, Charlie, he's already said we are just, being swatted with the fly being swatted off the rump of the elephant, really. But yeah. What's that? What should we be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to approach this is to think about the values that get incorporated into the AI that is running the media system. So in Silicon Valley, there's a buzzword called value alignment, and it's all about how do you get the AI system to align to human values. I tend to think of the editorial mission of news organizations as a very value-rich kind of thing to think about, and that journalists, if they really want a piece of the future media ecosystem, need to think seriously about how to design those values into AI systems. That can take many different forms. It could take the form of training your own models, using your own data, and defining things in terms of what's the news values that are most important to your newsroom. It could take the form of, taking something open source off the shelf and fine-tuning it or adapting it to your values. But it does demand that you engage the technology very deliberately and be aware of how you're incorporating those values into the technology, such that it's consistent with how you see the technology supporting your mission.
I mean, that sounds great, and I have a long association with The Guardian, and I can see somewhere like The Guardian saying, well, we have to do that, and we also have a trust. I can see public service broadcasters also being able to do that. Uli, do you want to make a point on that? Because I feel like that might be an option for a small number of elite organizations. I'm not sure whether it's actually an option for really pressured commercial organizations.
Mm-hmm. Good point and good question, because I won't have a final answer to that, I guess. But to your point, Nick, using technology for your own USP, this is kind of a mantra we are always repeating when people ask us, how can we use this technology for our means? Have a close look at your digital USP as a media house, and perhaps rethink it, and then look at technology and see how this technology can support this USP. And to make it practical, we as a public service broadcaster, we are using it for public service personalization. We, for example, built a prototype around personalizing audio news in a regional way. So not sending our users into filter bubbles, but regionalizing news. And we are using algorithms to segment our audios, to recombine them in a regional way, and to offer a new digital product. If you have such a prototype around, you can test very easily how your users perceive that, and then you can move forward. So using this technology for your USP is the one thing, and the other thing I would love to say, we're seeing a lot of ethical guidelines coming out right now. We also published ours, and I really appreciate that. There's a lot of talk around what can we do with AI and automation, and how can we do it in an ethical way. So this is also, I guess, what you were talking about, Nick.
Yeah, and I really do think it comes down to values. You know, you might have heard Elon Musk is launching a new AI effort to train Truth GPT, and this is really sort of the beginning of the politicization of AI, and that's because AI incorporates a lot of values in terms of how the data is defined and how it's used to train and fine-tune these models. And it's going to get political, and to the extent that journalists want, you know, some kind of depoliticized model that incorporates how they see the world, or think the AI should see the world, then I think they need to get on board with developing their own tech.
And that's always been the case, hasn't it, Nick? That any tools and technologies involve editorial values. We, as an industry, we used to be highly dependent on advertising. And I remember, you know, learned books about how, you know, news media was being controlled by corporate interests because we're so dependent on that revenue.
Google has fixed that for us, in fairness.
That's right, because they've taken the advertising away, so we don't have that temptation anymore. But the whole point of my project is not to, you know, to throw the technology at newsrooms. It's actually to try and empower them to think about how their values, their editorial mission relates to the adoption of these technologies. And, you know, that could be because you're a very mission-driven public service newsroom, or it could be you are a more commercial one. And it's a tool, so you have the option of using it to deliver clickbait and rather shallow commercial journalism, if you want. And I think, you know, we are already in that situation where you can have a very powerful media organization, as we saw with the Dominion case currently in the States, who can pump out lies and propaganda. So it's always been part of the editorial debate, if you like, the ideological debate within the news media. This, in that sense, is nothing new, and we should be better at this, because that's what journalists do. They have editorial values, they make judgments, they edit themselves to make sure that what they're doing adheres to those values. And Uli knows, because she's worked with my project, that you can actually use the AI as a way of accounting for your ethical values. You can use it to address not just the biases of the technology, but perhaps the biases of your own journalists as well. So, you know, I don't think we should see this as some kind of virgin territory. You know, any experienced journalist who's been, as you said, Emily, you've been through it yourself, the going online, the adoption of social media, and in that sense, we've had some experience. Although I agree, this is different in many ways, but we have got experience of it.
But we also made critical errors, I think, and I'll hold my hands up to that as well, in being too optimistic about the implementation of the technology. And so in some ways, I guess I'm asking, you know, are we just entering another cycle which moves at faster speed, greater scale, with a similar level of inability, really, to sort of to tackle it on our terms as a news industry, and that is something that worries me, that we will see rather what happened with social media, which is, you know, the news media saw it as an opportunity and a threat, and then ultimately didn't really understand enough about what it was going to do to the whole field, and didn't really, at the point at which they did start to understand it, didn't really have the resources to do very much about it. Am I being overly Nick? Am I being overly pessimistic about this?
I mean, I think news organizations have got to play this in different ways, and they've got to investigate the technology as much as figure out whether or not they want to incorporate the technology and how they're working. So another, you know, lever on tech power is to, you know, investigate it, report, accountability reporting, and use that as a way to try to shape how the technology evolves.
And I think, just very quickly on that, there are some fantastic organizations like the Markup doing great work on actually using AI to report upon AI. It's an amazing. But I would make a big plea that all journalists need to know more about these technologies, because it's not just about the impact on our industry, it's about the impact of these technologies on every aspect of the lives and the world that we're supposed to be reporting upon.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And actually, when you look at there have been lots of really fantastic panels about AI at this Perugia. In fact, as somebody was saying, you can always tell what's happening in the industry by the dominant theme of the panels, and AI is definitely it. But I don't know that we've had many on. We've had how to use the tools, but we haven't had many on actually covering the field and the technology and the societal
impact. Go to our website. There is stuff on that, and it's very inspirational, and I think it's very, very necessary.
Yeah, and of course we've been developing techniques for algorithmic accountability reporting. Now AI accountability reporting. We've been developing techniques for 10 years, and the Markup is doing it, and there are others who are doing it. We probably need like 10 times as much investigation of technology in society.
I'm going to go sorry, yes, go on.
Jump in, sorry. I guess it's a horizontal layer, like climate reporting. It's not just one silo team working around AI. It helps if you have specialists, because you need people who have statistics knowledge, who are machine learning guys. So we really appreciate the specialist team we have. But we're also working on integrating that into economy, into also sports. I mean, more or less every beat we're having.
Yes, I was going to say there really isn't a beat. I mean, even if you start to think about, well, maybe culture, but actually, culture is going to be one of the most affected fields, it seems to me, by sort of synthesis, etc.
Everywhere.
Could I just make a final note on this?
You can. Sorry, just think of your questions and put your hands up. Let's go to audience questions, but I don't want to stop Felix.
No. It's just one thing I found interesting over the last couple of days, and I mean, all the AI panels were so interesting and really great, and I appreciated having them and being able to go to them. But a big problem with this is we sort of tend to focus on the nitty-gritty details, and is this tool going to make such and such difference for what I do? And it's quite easy to sort of lose the bigger picture among these things, and that has in some ways happened to us with social media in the past, where we sort of got enamored by all the capabilities of the technology and what it could do for the news. We kind of just ignored or neglected to look at the broader structural long-term implications, and that's sort of one of my worries when it comes to the adoption of technology. I think it's great that newsrooms are experimenting. In some ways, it's inevitable. The technology is there. You can't put it back in the box. But especially when it comes to the control that platform companies have, and the technology sector broadly construed over the technology itself, over the development and where it goes, I think that's something we shouldn't forget as this technology sort of slowly seeps into news work.
Right. And I think also we're up here talking about sort of almost like elite use cases, and then actually what's happening is there is a vast volume of completely sort of mundane, replicated content, which is just good, which is vast and can be now replicated at sort of zero extra cost. And I do wonder both whether actually the platform companies that are involved in this have even thought about the implications of infinite content, particularly where the most of it is either unhelpful, mundane, etc. It's that's something which I think is really problematic. Which is, I would love it to all be data investigations and smart implementation, but we've already seen that it's about doing mortgage rate reports from every single website that wants to kind of optimize that and sort of get clicks back. So I'm not sure kind of where we get that quality imperative to rise in the overall ecosystem if we don't, particularly if we don't have the buy-in of platforms on that. So if they're agnostic, if they are content agnostic, I think there's a great danger in that as well. Questions? Anyone have a question? Yes. So that's good. If we start here, and then we have two more in the middle. So just here. Yeah.
Hello. I'm here.
Oh, sorry.
I'm here.
I'm looking in the wrong.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yes, fine.
No problem.
So we'll start there, and then we'll go over there.
Okay.
Yes.
So, could I give technology giants more control of the news? Technology giants have the potential to gain more control of the news with increasing use of algorithm in news creation and distribution. The algorithm could be programmed to prioritize certain stories or viewpoints, which could influence the public opinion and shape the news narrative. Additionally, tech companies could use their dominance in advertising and use data to promote or suppress certain news sources or types of content and so on. This is not ChatGPT.
Right.
This is Pizza GPT. And I'd like to ask, so what are the consequences that the fact that in Italy ChatGPT is not allowed because of the current debate of regulation and so on? So what's the path of regulation, and how can we solve that?
So I think, yes, that is a great point, which is, this unevenness of regulation. Who wants to pick up the regulatory? Nobody's looking at me now,
Well,
so Nick will.
I could say something about the Italian restriction of ChatGPT, because I ran a session on generative AI in the newsroom a couple of days ago, and as soon as I landed in Italy, I'm like, ugh, are people going to be able to use this? Because I'd like to demo it. And it's actually a pretty soft restriction, right? So, if you go to ChatGPT, it's, it gives you a message that says you can't access it. But you can actually go to the playground, the OpenAI playground, and use all of the ChatGPT models. Or you can access it through other services which kind of use the API for ChatGPT. So it's not really blocked. I mean, it seems like it's an initiative to try to get tech companies to the table to discuss their data privacy and protection standards, and I think that's a good thing. I'm glad Italy stepped out and did that, because it started a conversation. It started a conversation amongst other folks in Europe who also have GDPR and data protection standards, unlike the US. And so that's an opening to start that conversation, and I don't know where it's going to land, but we've started it at least.
Because we have a lot of questions, I'm going to move swiftly to the centre of the room.
Hi, Robert Mackenzie. I used to run innovation for BBC News, and now a lecturer and consultant. I'm just wondering if you think it's more of a challenge or an opportunity that the news industry is such a tiny part of the technology company's business. Is that something we can take advantage of, or is that a threat to us?
So this is something where, Charlie, you've basically said this is a good thing, that we are only a blip on the radar. What is the view, Uli, what do you think about the insignificance of news in the overall economic information environment?
All in all, it's bad, of course.
It's bad, of course. Yeah, there we go.
Because look at contracts we have to do with vendors, also with OpenAI. So they're not really interested in getting us on board very fast. They're not really interested in asking our opinion. And, saying what you want is one way to talk to tech firms, and tech firms seem to be interested in news because, we are in a unique position to reach audience, so we're in part interesting for them. But I agree, we are just a tiny bit of the economy, and sometimes I would love to see us a bigger part of this economy.
Yeah, and I think one of the values, and obviously I'm justifying my particular project, but one of the values of individual news organizations like yours being thoughtful about it, and projects like mine where I'm funded by Google, I don't particularly work with them, but it does give us a chance to put the news voice to them, to show them, in a non-hostile way. We're saying, okay, that we like the potential of this stuff, thank you very much, as it were. We don't actually expect you to do it all for us, but can you at least let us be part of a conversation around it? And I think that is so hard to do anyway, because, as I said, if you talk, and I hope this is not sort of speaking out of school, but when I talk to Google, I have to beg to get their attention sometimes. I'd love to talk to their engineers more. And
but isn't this just totally symptomatic of what's broken with the relationship. So there you are, running a project about AI in newsrooms funded by Google, and it's difficult even for you to get to the right people to talk about it. I mean, that just seems
Sure,
like
sure, but I'm
absolute-
a realist. I know that the alternative would be, if my project wasn't funded, there wouldn't even be that space.
No,
you
well,
know,
we don't take funding from any of the
No,
platforms.
but you work for one of the richest universities in the world, so that's nice. You know, okay. You've got that luxury that you
as
you can
opposed to the
have that.
impoverished LSE. But
we
the
don't have
point is,
endowments,
but the
yeah.
point is, if you won't engage with Google on their terms, they don't engage with you. And I think it doesn't matter, you know, how much money you have. That is the truth of the matter. So you do have this problem that we're always engaging on their terms rather than necessarily on our terms.
I'm trying to think of a company that engages with journalism on our terms.
Well,
You know, like the big pharma. You know, I'm thinking of politicians.
Big Pharma are not running newsrooms.
No, but they're very important in the world.
Anyway,
I'm just
I'll
saying,
go to-
what's the dream of a company that says, no, actually, I fully embrace critical, independent journalism?
Well,
Let's be realistic. There's nobody that does that apart from journalists.
But if you're making yourself part of the infrastructure of the industry and then saying fundamentally we're doing this as a lobbying exercise, that doesn't seem very healthy to me. Anyway, next question. Sorry, it has become very adversarial. There are two hands up, yeah, in the middle. If we get the microphone over there.
Hi, I'm Giulia from the University of Milan, and I want to ask you, if we train algorithm with data and we lead with disaggregated data, the AI will be a discriminator, will increase social discrimination. Like, for example, we don't have data disaggregated by gender.
Right.
And if you think that it will increase discrimination, how can we deal with this?
Mm-hmm.
That's
a great question. There's a wonderful paper about stochastic parrots written by 4 women, incidentally, and I've seen 2 men already use stochastic parrots without any reference to the actual sort of researchers who said this is actually going to cause kind of greater problems with bias. Nick, a lot of your work is focused on this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've got to be thinking about the potential for representational harm when using these models to generate content that's then published. I think there's a couple of avenues to think about here. One is investigating the models that are out there to kind of put some numbers down and say, well, just how big is the bias and where is the bias exactly? And there are researchers who are working on that, and I'd love to see more news organizations digging into that as well. Another avenue is to, you know, again, be aware of the potential for bias, and if you're using these models, think about how to prompt the models in different ways and or correct representational harms before publication. So, you know, human in the loop, you've got to be aware that this is an issue that can happen, and then think about your role as an editor in correcting for that and being aware of your role in that system.
I think that's a good point. I mean, Chris Moran at The Guardian always says, just think about it as you would think about the rest of your journalism. Like, you know, you don't think about AI sort of sitting separately. How do you think about that, Ali? Because you're, again, in terms of, you mentioned this, what about the things that it will exaggerate or amplify, and how do newsrooms correct for that?
Yeah, great question. And it goes back to dependency as well. We just did an investigation on image recognition algorithms. This is something that runs the internet, and it really, influences what you see on the internet and what you don't see. And we reverse engineered several APIs from the big tech giants and wanted to see if pictures showing women are treated the same than pictures showing men. And we only looked at one score. We called it sexiness score. In reality, it's called raciness score, but no one knows what raciness is, so sexiness. And women always got a higher score than men. Just me sitting here would be scored higher than you sitting here. Sorry, Nick.
Oh, it's a bit harsh, but yes.
But in reality, this is a bad thing, because you have a bias in this, foundational technology. And if people are using those APIs, like media companies using those APIs, you have this bias in your product and you're not aware of that. We need more of those investigations. We need to be conscious about what we are using. And this is said so easily because who has the resources to investigate every API they're using? The answer is no one. So we have to have those investigations and we have to be mindful of what we are using, and I guess read those investigations as well, just to make a little ad for our work.
We have time for one more. One more. There we go.
Hi, my name is Laurens Vreekamp. I'm from the Netherlands, and first of all, I would like to thank you for all of you for doing the pioneering work in AI and journalism over these last few years. I have a question because we're talking about big technology, and it's a what-if question. So if we move away from big tech into big AI, how should we engage with companies we don't know? Should we choose the devil we know, the big tech companies, or can we dictate the engagement?
Thank you for great concluding questions. I'm going to throw that to Felix first.
Oh God, yeah, thanks for the question. I think in general the same rule should apply everywhere. You should always look closely at the company or the vendor you're working with, and you should try to scrutinize what they're doing and how they're doing it and how it's going to affect you, and ideally also not just you but the entire news industry and therefore the public. And that shouldn't matter if you're dealing with Google, Microsoft or AWS, or if it's a smaller vendor. So I think in general, always be skeptical, always be careful. That's sort of my quick take on this.
Yeah,
what about you, Charlie? Are you ditching Google for some smaller companies?
Yeah, well, if they pay more, yeah. I think one of the interesting, I was speaking to a very senior executive in a very powerful commercial news organization based in New York, and it was intriguing. They were saying, picking up on the point about, Musk is now deciding to get in on this, They were saying the one good thing about generative AI is that at the moment it seems to be introducing some more competition. That it isn't just Google, say, that you can deal with. And there is this kind of instability now in the marketplace again. And it may be that even little old news media may be able to take advantage of that. I don't want to exaggerate this, I don't want to be too optimistic, but that change in the big tech landscape may offer some alternatives, and as you say, they may be worse alternatives. But so Felix is quite right. Caution should prevail. Yeah. But it is quite interesting.
But could I briefly step in on this? I think the idea of more competition, I think it's certainly true to some extent. But then if you look at OpenAI and all these sort of smaller vendors, they're still dependent in many ways on these bigger companies because they need cloud access, they need the computing infrastructure, they need the data. So nominally, yes, it looks like there is more competition, but every competition economist would look at this and say, well, actually, if we sort of look under the hood, is that true competition? Or is it still just a new set of actors who are just as dependent in other ways?
Most of those smaller organizations are probably just hoping to get bought by Google or Microsoft or one of the other big ones.
Right. Okay, well, that's a very downbeat note on which to end, but that was actually, thank you so much to the panel. What a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much indeed for great questions. I've been absolutely cut off. I'd love to take another question, but I can't, unfortunately. Thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your day inside venues when it's beautifully sunny outside. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.